Andrew, how's it going?
Good, man. How you doing?
Pretty good. Trying something new. Trying to interview my friends and talk to them about cool ideas.
Dude, let's do it. That sounds dope. Yeah, totally.
Cool. What have you been thinking about these days?
Um, hmm. Well, yeah, I've been thinking lots about, I guess personally like science fiction and the future. Um, and then also like the advent of AI seems to be like a metaphysically significant event in some ways. And certainly challenges. I mean, I don't know. Is it metaphysical? I don't know, but certainly like big social economic impact. But it raises all these crazy questions about theory of the mind and consciousness and stuff like that. So I think that's kind of been where my head's at. And I really enjoy writing. So writing is to me like probably the first what I would call like a transhuman technology. And what I mean is something where by inventing that you radically, we should actually say language. Language is certainly this, but perhaps language, and then writing especially so. But an invention that radically transforms you, right? Like it's a self-modifying process, right? So you invent this tool to solve some problem in your environment. It could be a social problem, resource, whatever, you know, and then the existence of that tool, its effects backpropagate through society, and then create new selective pressures on individuals that produce new, biological outcomes, right? Like our brains are now so highly structured for speech and the manipulation of concepts. It's become ingrained some way. Like we have grown into language ourselves, even though language is like a cultural or thing, right? I think it's pretty interesting. Yeah, and I think transhumanism is like it's big in science fiction, like cyberpunk stuff, and usually it's like, oh, we're going to implant ourselves with like nanobots or like hydraulic legs or like whatever. And I think we're already there. I think we're already transhumans. I think certainly writing and language. I would say also like cell phones and digital social media stuff is has this flavor.
Um, that's sort of the premise of the book *Sapiens*, or at least that was my take. Right? Is like there are
Oh,
these concepts which create pressures on society and change the way that like humans relate to each other. Really, is that what you're getting at, or is it different?
I think that's part of it. Um, Yeah, there's a couple layers there, I think. One is to think of this as how do you adapt and respond to changing circumstances and like achieve ecological fitness, right? So the pace of genetic adaptation is quite small compared to mimetic adaptation or like the idea space, you know? This is like software versus hardware, right? It's hard to update your hardware. It is easy to change the software that runs on it. And certainly certainly software is hardware limited in a sense, you know? So we have to organize knowledge into things that are understandable by humans. And so there are things in the world that no one person can understand. They're too complicated, and so we have to find other ways of solving those problems. Like a good example is probably like economic markets, right? Like the problem of supply and demand and coordinating production it's just way too much for any one person or committee or whatever. Like centralized economies don't seem to do that well. But ones that use like market mechanisms, which is like a distributed protocol where tons of like agents kind of follow simple behavior, and the net effect of that is to do, some price discovery or relative valuation of assets or whatever. Um, yeah. So I think concepts as like an adaptation to the environment, I think is like an important way to think about it.
So I guess like what are some concepts? So you mentioned writing. I think like markets or money or even like the concept of debt. Are you talking about things like that?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah, we've basically invented a conceptual landscape that we now live in, right? Um, so we don't live in a world. We don't live in the jungle. We're not living in right. Like the built environment, the social environment is one that wholly consists of concepts. As like how am I going to navigate things? We're very rarely faced with physical danger, all this kind of stuff. Um, I think it's interesting too. It's like so. Hmm. Thinking more like let's build our way up to society, right? So it's like as an individual perceiver of the world, I construct knowledge, which I would describe as like knowledge embedded in the structure of space and time, right? Like kind of Kant.
Hmm.
Um, I construct those observation, that raw data into knowledge through kind of the formation of stories and narratives. And then where that really becomes like in our modern sense of like scientific knowledge is like to what extent can you extrapolate or abstract away specifics of that story to now get like a general world model or story generator, right? Which is like the law of gravity, right? Like literally, like we used to have stories about how the planets traveled across the skies and they were dragged by chariots or they were embedded in some sphere or something. That's some story about the world. Now it's like the story is there's a mathematical structure to the universe. There's this general relativity, curvature of space-time, all that kind of stuff. I think probably in my mind, what's interesting about this is probably before the birth of America, and I'm Canadian for reference, so I'm like kind of patriotic to a country that I'm an immigrant to and not even a citizen. Is that it was the first time we sort of like, how do we use kind of this first principles reasoning, which is like abstracted from as many stories as possible, right? Stories about government, stories about self-organization, about civic society, to generate kind of from first principles how a country should work for the benefit of its people or something like that, right? Could we write from scratch like a new story, right? Drawing upon all the things we've learned from the past, all the history of antiquity and whatever, Middle Ages, write a new story about how we should live as people. And I think this is interesting because all of this scientific and economic prosperity is entirely downstream of social institutions. And those social institutions are entirely built on a story about how to live together and what's important and what's not. And so that's why I think it's like, I kind of had this phrase in my mind recently, but like storytelling is maybe the most powerful force in human world in some weird way. Like it can launch like, a massive expedition across the ocean. It can launch like Columbus, right? Was like, Columbus is like the ultimate deep tech entrepreneur, really, because he pitched Queen Isabella of Spain, or was it Portugal? I kind of forget. And then he had his crew, he had a startup, dude. That was his seed round, and then he just went to the new America and like had a huge return. So I think stories. I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot of places we can go with this conversation from there.
Well, I guess one question that comes to mind is what makes for a good story that takes off and launches expeditions versus something that just like doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah. Well, yeah, this is a good question. Stories have to be about humans navigating the environment and the world. I think it's hard to tell a sci-fi story that's good without there being characters that have like some relatability, right? Because it's really, I think stories. Okay, so storytelling. It's not just recounting the past, but it's building this ability to emulate the future, right? And I think this is related to this act of knowledge construction, where it's like I observe myself acting, whatever, doing stuff. I observe other people acting as well, social individuals. Now I build a narrative or a model where I am a character in that model as well. Now I gain this reflexive identity. Now I gain this new thing, which is this ability to place myself into hypothetical situations, right? And this is like synthetic data for learning, okay? This is kind of great. Like, where we're short on data, how do you learn? How do you do this stuff? Generate synthetic data. Okay, generate an accurate world model of how stuff works, war game it out, chess game it, whatever, see what happens, and learn from that. So I think good stories have to have this ability of pulling you from where you are and placing you into them as a simulated or imagined world where you're now in the decision making, or you're thinking, what would I do in that situation? This kind of stuff. Stories that are like just descriptions of raw technical details or specifications, or the stories physics tell are actually pretty alien and abstract. Like, how would I describe the evolution of life on Earth? Is like what quantities of entropy and Gibbs free energy and gigatons of various molecules or something. Like, it just says nothing, right? It's like, what the hell? Yeah. And so so I think it's like, for us as humans, we need to have good stories to jump into that we can empathize with. What's interesting now is that we've had so much of this written text collected as experiences, as thoughts, as descriptions of the world. Now we're using that to build, we're kind of going in reverse, right? Like, we use this raw data into narratives for causality to survive. Now this emulation of events to synthetic data predict stuff. Now we're using all of this text, raw text, to now build the mind backwards in silicon, right? It's like we're pushing the other direction. And probably a huge question is for a lot of people, like, do you actually get all the way back to the original thing, which is us having an ego, a first-person perspective as a perceiver of things? Can you get there from just raw text stories? Like, can you push the other way as well? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. When people are probing these LLMs these days, I think it's super interesting what they're coming up with. It's like, really, it's probably the most interesting stuff I've seen actually in a long time. I think this is the surprising thing, is that with these LMs, especially Claude 3 that came out recently, like it's so good. It like really, you notice this is a new level of depth. Where it really, they can become so good at world building, right? World building, and like, especially in a science fiction kind of sense, in like an imaginative extrapolation of things, or in a certain character or voice. And it's getting better and better at making those stories realistic, right? As like believable, as like, oh yeah, if I did have these people at a dinner table conversation, what would they talk about? And it's like doing a good job emulating that. So that's cool, because that's kind of the magic recipe behind this whole, like, how do you imagine and then build the future, right? Which is like, can you distill a vast body of knowledge into a coherent kind of narrative about how things will play out in a way that's compelling, in a way that would motivate people to want to work towards that? This act of like imaginative world building about future scenarios that excite people and capture their imagination, and then can actually motivate people to get together, band together their resources to go and build the ships to find the new world, or colonize it, or steal it from people that live there already, however you want to interpret this. Or build a rocket and go to the moon, because no one that we know lives there yet. So it's kind of open territory. Or Mars, right? That's, to me, that's like the ultimate kind of like, wow, that's like the nobility of the human spirit, and this quest for the unknown, and this exploration of frontiers. And if we can train that, if we can teach Silicon to dream, to dream big, I think that's like a really, I think that's kind of profound.
Yeah, that makes sense. What kind of stories do you think the world needs now?
I think good stories and good science fiction in general are glimpses of possible future worlds, and probably they're glimpses of possible future worlds in a way that gets people to think about them, anticipate them, such that they are ready for that development or change. So having stories that I think can realistically capture underlying dynamics at the sociological level, macroeconomic or anthropological, how's culture evolving, as well as technological landscape, right? And kind of push these forward out and get people to step into them and think, oh wow, that's interesting. Or this is kind of like the whole, like, any efforts for AI risk mitigation, for example. It's all about getting people to imagine hypotheticals and to think ahead, because it's like there's no precedent for this event or this kind of transformation in some ways. And so how do you get people like to embrace it in a way where you can have good outcomes? I think the Industrial Revolution, people talk about AI like the internet. I think the Industrial Revolution is a better analogy. It has a lot of strong analogies. One, it's a very disruptive event, socially speaking. So the internet was like a genuinely new class of communications infrastructure, and that it enabled a massive number of new kind of things. But like, the Industrial Revolution was a fundamentally new way of producing things, right? In a physical way, right? So physical goods before that were incredibly expensive, like clothing and tables and cutlery and whatever. And like, now we live in like absolute mass manufactured abundance. Material goods have become quite cheap. The thing that has not gotten cheaper over time are professional services. So, being able to now mass produce knowledge services, that's like a similar step change in like in productive capacity for like a really fundamental source of, I guess, I would say this is like enabler of people, right? The thing is, the Industrial Revolution had this terrible part to it, right? Which was like the satanic mills, like the foul beast come at last, slouching towards Bethlehem, whatever, second coming. All these authors wrote about it. George Orwell wrote about it. The Road to Wigan Pier is a really good book. Yeah, detailing like the kind of social destruction wrought by this industrialism and like people in squalid conditions. And because for generations they had lived with like an ancestral claim to farming, you know having a cottage, and they just give up some of their produce. And people lived in villages as communities, and it was a very human way to live. And suddenly you have things like the Enclosure Act, whatever, pushing people into cities, urbanization, driving them into much smaller homes, close contact with each other. Now it's wage labor, they're paying for things, commodification of relationships between people in society. This is a massive social disruption, right? Because they just had no legal framework for anticipating the magnitude of social changes brought about by this revolution in production of material goods. And I feel like we also do not have a anticipatory legal framework, social, moral framework, whatever, for infinite production of knowledge goods. Because right now we have a knowledge-based economy. And so, it's sort of like, oh, damn, this is, an analogous thing has happened in the past, right? And that was really terrible for everyone. And I think if we can more accurately imagine these future scenarios as social forces and technology mature together, then we can actually get a more kind of organic synthesis between ourselves and the tools we make, such that the changes that do occur are not so calamitous and massive and drastic and tragic all at once. That's the hope, I think, is if you can tell good stories, people will think about the future in a way that helps them navigate it successfully. Yeah. And there's like a lot of motivation to navigate it successfully.
Yeah. Are there certain stories that you think are getting in the way that we need to uninstall from ourselves or society?
Totally. Yeah, that's a great question. And that's obviously a very politically contentious question as well. I think I'm gonna answer that in a very roundabout way, kind of talking about two ideas I've had in my mind lately between decentralization and centralization. Okay. I think the dynamic tension in society is always, how do you have an arena for decentralization, for competition, for the production of new things, new ideas, and this kind of stuff? Because that breeds fitness. That is how you get, innovation, entrepreneurship, all these things we like. At the same time, scaling those solutions up in a way that benefits everyone. So I think it's like, how do we balance this thing where we want people to compete, we want there to be competition to generate new things, whereas we also want to kind of guarantee levels of safety and dignity for everyone. I think those two narratives are key to understanding political tensions and what kinds of stories are no longer serving us too well. I would say, like, more pragmatically, the idea that centralized authority can protect and provide for everyone is appealing. I think it appeals to people who have material abundance, right? And they think we can distribute this more equally in a way that's like fair and just. Like we first principles designed the rules for society. Why can't we first principles design rules for who gets what? The issue there is that those narratives, which are really well-intentioned and kind of come from a mindset of abundance, they end up getting corrupted or co-opted by people who are just playing kind of zero-sum games, political games themselves. So in general, I think, like, the general observation is, whenever you have centralization of control over things that are too complicated for one person to decide in an unbiased way, you end up driving worse outcomes for everyone. So I think when it comes to like encountering this unknown future, right, it's like, you kind of want more decentralization than centralization, actually, because the future is unknown and it's filled with risks, and you want to have many different approaches to face it, right? What you don't want is incumbents monopolizing or using their power and influence to change the rules of the game to suppress that competition, right? This is, I think, probably the biggest risk that we face as a society, or one of the biggest risks, is people are not actually interested so often in competing on the same level field, right? They are interested in, or they do it because they can or because they have to, but how do I actually like bribe the ref? How do I change the rules of the game to favor my interests in this way? Like, how do I get the regulatory capture? How do I make sure the competition is outlawed? Like, there's this really simple example, which is like hydrogen as a lifting gas for airships. Okay. Yeah, so it was banned. I mean, the Hindenburg was a disaster, but airships are not inherently explosive. Okay, like during
Hmm.
World War One, hydrogen-filled airships came and tried to bomb London, and people would shoot them with machine guns, and just totally nothing would happen. Like it's just hydrogen. It needs to be mixed with a lot of oxygen to combust. So the Hindenburg, like there's lots of science behind what happened there. But does that mean we should ban hydrogen as lifting gas forever? Well, what's the history of that? And you dig into it, and there's like some kind of test by the Colorado School of Mines in the 1930s where they demonstrate the danger of hydrogen, and they did so by filling a massive balloon with hydrogen and then popping it with a lit match or something, and the whole thing exploded. It exploded because they also mixed it with pure oxygen, right? Because the people that set up the test and the demonstration that were pushing this legislation, they wanted to not have hydrogen zeppelins because they were selling helium, because they were capturing helium as part of a gas refinery operation or something. So this is just a great example of like, why don't we have hydrogen airships? Oh, it's because some market incumbents use their positions of power and authority to stifle innovation, to whatever, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so now like the game is big. AI, who controls that? Should it be centralized? Should it be decentralized? The voices talking about centralization, I think, are often doing it under the guise of safety and control, saying that it's too dangerous for everyone to have, and so we need to control it. And it's like, well, damn, that's I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that.
Yeah. Wait,
um,
so in this case, what would decentralization look like? More open source models or what?
yeah, more open source models. Open source models definitely the way to go. Also thinking like, what does it take to run and train these models too? Like that's another thing. It's a lot, right? It's a lot of compute, a lot of data centers, a lot of you need hundreds of millions, billions of dollars now to train like a next competitive foundation model. I think
Yeah.
so. It's very taxing. It's the analogies to the nuclear arms weapons program are always so tempting, right? Because it's like, oh well, look, you can have unlimited energy and also nuclear weapons, and AI is like, look, you can have unlimited knowledge production and also super intelligent. I think that the dynamics are so different, though. I think the analogy is kind of worn thin now. I think for people's minds. So I don't know if nuclear weapons are still a useful. Well, actually, no, maybe not weapons. Nuclear energy, nuclear overall as a topic, that may be still a useful story to understand the potential promise of AI and the risk of centralized safetyism, right? And you just have to look at today, like why do we have the climate crisis? Why do we have all of these carbon emissions from our energy grids when we've had nuclear energy since the 1950s, right? So
Hmm.
France, nuclearified their electricity grid within like 10 years, like 1970, 1980, 80% nuclear ever since. America went to like 20% nuclear and just stayed there. Right?
Yeah.
And like Germany had plans to go completely nuclear. And there's all these people, all these reports, even by Shell, talking about how fossil fuels were to be a transitory, kind of energy supply for the economy, and that baseload would now be delivered by nuclear, which is carbon free. But nuclear energy production is also on the road to nuclear weapons, and nuclear weapons are scary and dangerous. Cold War, right? And
Yeah.
so we've already, we've robbed ourselves of an abundant golden age, right, of energy prosperity by regulating to death this like promising uh, mastery of the natural world. And I think, it's possible to do it again for sure.
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Right. And so
Mm-hmm.
I guess how do you create a narrative that advocates for progress while at the same time also sufficiently anticipating or mitigating these like tail risks?
So that's a problem that's probably too big for any one person to solve, right?
Yeah.
So again, it's like when the problem's too big for any one person to solve, what do humans do, right? They have some decentralized process that performs higher level cognition and awareness through some decentralized protocol, right? A competition, a fitness, whatever. So it's like, what does that look like? Well, it's representative democracy, man. That's it, right? I think that's the more you can synthesize and integrate different perspectives and voices into this overall picture, overall landscape, the more compelling the image will be of the future, and the more accurate it'll be, and the more it will actually represent the interests of the people who have skin in the game. Or I mean, we all have skin in the game. It's everyone has skin in the game. The game is staying alive, or living in society and flourishing. Yeah. So that's actually one thing I'm really optimistic about is, democracy is a tool set, democracy is a technology, and it's enabled a lot, right? But it's also of a certain time. And so even before we have anything like AGI or whatever, there's still so much potential for these tools of thought to also be tools of democracy, right? In organizing, synthesizing, getting people's perspectives, right? And this is great because you can do this mathematical comparison of ideas, and so you can actually find like what is the true, general will, right, as well as the individual will, right, of all these people together. So we kind of have to build the tools to address the future, right? And the tools do look like reimagining our social contract and being willing to reimagine it. And I know it's predicated on, like even in the United States, the Constitution, I think the people who wrote it expected it to actually be rewritten a lot more than it was in the end,
Yeah.
and it's sort of ossified, right? And think about, 1776, 1779, the world is so different, right? So we may have to radically reimagine what it means to live in a society, how society should work, how things, how people live together, right? Are nation states still relevant? I think that should be an open question. Yeah. So I think the real question is like, can you fundamentally adapt and change the rules of a society without breaking it apart and building it from scratch? And now that we're coming to a very interesting part of history, right? Even if the outcome on the far side is superabundance and awesome, I think also like kind of how do we be bold enough to imagine a new way of living such that it's not a terrible experience to go through?
Yeah. I guess if you were to put out a concrete call to action for, I don't know, builders, founders, or even just regular people, what would it be?
Probably the more you approach these things with playful curiosity, and look to integrate them and let them change your way of thinking about things, the better off you'll be. I think the better off everyone will be, because I think the worst outcomes are really from when people are hit with something they don't see coming and they don't have intuition for, and so playing with the AI stuff, playing with the explorations, sharing your explorations with other people, I think that can open up a lot of new conversations. And we can really we can develop intuition for these things that are going to happen before they've completely happened, and I think that's really important. And so I think this mentality of keeping it distant, like you're trying to hold back the tide, it's going to only work so long, right?
Yeah.
So instead, just play in the water, get wet, acclimatize a little bit, we'll be fine, kind of thing. Playful curiosity. I would say that's about it.
Good place to end.
God, that's great.
Yeah.
That was great. It was great, man. I talked. You just let me talk about shit, and it's all so weird, but it was fun. I should run though, because someone's waiting for me.
Yeah. Sweet. Okay. Cool. Thanks so much, man.